One of our themes over the past few days, as I've said, has been relationships, getting to know people, making that authentic connection with them in our careers. And at NPR, as Brackton, our
I know, I
prior
called
speaker,
Brackton. I saw him, he was tweeting about this.
as Brackton reminded us, sometimes at NPR it was a situation of when we saw another person of color, it was like, come to the light. It was very much, we had to
Have to look
make
out
those
for each other.
connections to
Yeah.
survive. But what I also learned from Alicia's story was the ability to pivot, to quickly adjust to the turmoil and the drama and the whatnot of being in a newsroom. And now, as she has just stated, shifting from a nonprofit to a for-profit newsroom and making that adjustment. And so now, of course, everyone is talking about podcasts. Everybody's talking about, is that a way to tell stories and to get news across? And certainly their popularity is surging. So we are privileged to have the executive editor for podcasts for Slate here with us today. So Alicia, take it away.
Thank you. Something that's challenging, it's not just challenging for journalists of color. It's also challenging for white journalists to create relationships inside a newsroom and to create relationships with sources. And I think that's something that we need to understand, and it's really critical when you're a person of color, is that you are not the problem in these connections. You're not the problem in building the relationships. The system is the problem, and the system will punish you for things that it will not punish the white person who's sitting next to you for. And so when you're forming partnerships and relationships with your team inside a newsroom, it's important to get to know the people you're working with and to figure out what your shared objective is. I think sometimes, it's tempting to step into a newsroom and think that every person of color there is part of the squad. I heard from Brackton and from some other people a couple of years ago that I was known as one of the auntie squad. I was on the auntie squad at NPR. I don't mind. I don't mind. There are some people here who can tell you that I have an auntie vibe. I have had that for a long time. But yeah. But what you want to do is you want to make sure that the people who you're connecting with don't just have sort of a racial and cultural background in common with you, but that they have a common objective. Because there are going to be people in the newsroom who are folks of color who are there to diversify the space, the way that they see diversifying it, adding new voices, getting new perspectives, telling new stories. And then there are people who come up through a system precisely because they're very useful to the white people who are in the leadership. And you need to spend some time getting to know people in your space before you make sort of presumptions about what they're prepared to do for you, what they're prepared to do for a mission that's important to you as far as diversifying content. The other thing to keep in mind is that whatever the relationship is that you're developing with your colleagues in the newsroom, you've got to bring something to the table. You've got to be offering some information, offering a source, offering a connection. You have to make sure that you're not one of 15. There's a 100-person newsroom. There are 5 people of color. There's 1 senior person of color. And it's a fair presumption that every junior person of color is lined up at that person's office. So if you want to sort of establish a connection with the leadership, you have to be clear about your terms, and you do have to say what your objective is and to get that person on board with your mission and not be a person who's who's positioning the conversation as a transaction that's going to benefit you and not the other person. I could talk more, but I really am intrigued by this collection of journalists. It's so exciting to be in a room of young journalists who are excited about podcasting and new opportunities. Audio journalism is, it's close to my heart. It's what I've always wanted to do. It's how I've spent my career. And when we talk about voice in journalism, sometimes we're just talking about which neighborhood you go to and whose quote you put first. But when you're talking about audio journalism, you are talking about the human voice. It brings people into a story in a way that a print quote just can't. You can hear the exhaustion. I mean, if any of us have been watching or listening to the hearings that are going on right now, and those of us who are women of color, and particularly Black women, there's so many things that we recognize just by listening. That thank you for that obvious and insulting question. Let me do my best to answer it politely. And that's something that you can't convey in a quote. And that's why it's so important in the audio medium that we're reaching out and that we are centering stories from that represent the diversity of the country and the communities that we serve. So, yeah, are there questions? Hi.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Rafael Carranza. I am a reporter for the Arizona Republic, and I have a question. I'm really excited that I'm going to have the opportunity to work on my first podcast this year. Mm-hmm. And thank you. And my question, I'm wondering if you can share, some tips or some advice on, when you're describing, or when you, like the topic, for example, that we're going to be covering happens to be the shooting that happened a few years ago. But it was, it happened along the border, so there's, there's very limited, to know, video, audio from that happened. Like you don't have like the 911 tapes, for example, mm-hmm. that have access. Since it's a federal case that was tried in federal court, you also don't have recordings of that. And so I'm wondering if you can share, like in those circumstances where you just don't have, like some good audio to kind of describe this really compelling scene and describe kind of like what happened. What are some alternatives that you can kind of do to give that, really compelling storytelling that's gonna, draw viewers in when you actually don't have like some of those, voices that you can incorporate to that?
Well, even if you don't have sort of at the moment coverage, you can reach out to people who were there. And when you talk about storytelling, I know that that's kind of a controversial term when it comes to journalism, but finding somebody who was at the event, and preferably people with more than one perspective, because depending on where you're sitting in a trial and depending on which side of the courtroom is your focus, you're going to be absorbing different things. And so if you can find the human being who was a witness to this event, who was in the courtroom, who was part of this process, and they can tell you what happened and they can tell you how their life or their experience or their viewpoints were changed by the proceedings. And I think that what you want to do is you want to get your listeners into the space and having somebody explain, I walked in the door, I was expecting this, it was cold, it was warm, the fan was broken, there was a constant buzz. Just giving those kind of details, you have to paint a picture with the words. And you just find somebody else who was there and have them tell the story to you and to your listeners. That's the best way.
Hi, I'm Acacia Jane.
Yes, hi.
I just wanted to ask, I was really excited to see your transition on LinkedIn years ago. Mm-hmm. Just what are some of the differences from NPR to Slate, doing podcasts, doing radio? I would just love to know how that was, because I was really excited when I saw that you were making that transition.
You know, I love NPR. I just want to get that out there. And I met next to my family, NPR is the place where I found the most people who I like, love, and care about in my adult life. Having said that, you know, the organization is not its worst people and it's not its best people. And I think that something that when you're involved in the nonprofit world, people can be very committed to explaining to you why the mission is at the center of everybody's work. But you have to observe, use your journalistic skills, observe, ask questions, ask different people in different positions in the organization questions, and figure out if the organization is about the mission or if the organization is willing to twist the mission to fit whatever works for the people in the leadership of the organization. I just got to a point, it was 20 years at NPR, and I left there loving it. But, you know, when you're a woman of color, I think in particular, you've got a lot of sort of calls on your spirit and calls on your emotional resources. And a lot of the time, I don't know if this is as true for men, but a lot of the time for women, an organization, especially a nonprofit organization, will capitalize on your willingness to work longer, work harder, watch people climb a ladder ahead of you, prevail upon your team spirit when what they're really asking for is for you to work more hours uncompensated. Right. You know, this wasn't, I mean, I had gotten to a point at NPR where I wasn't a person who was suffering from these things, but watching, you know, a generation of people, some of whom I personally encouraged to get into nonprofit journalism, and specifically NPR, be kind of ground down into that system. It just got to me. And what I've found at Slate is freedom, a lot of willingness to experiment, more of a let's try it out. I don't know if this is true for other newsrooms, but it certainly was true for NPR, that you could spend, a great idea would be born, and you would spend months trying to get a meeting with somebody who would ask for a PowerPoint, for someone who would ask for another meeting, with someone who would ask you to go to the 4th floor, and then the 6th floor, and then back to the 4th floor again, and then to an all-staff meeting. And maybe at the end of 18 months of that process, you might get something that sounded vaguely like the content that you had envisioned. And at Slate, I came there a couple of months afterward, the reckoning happened. I said, we don't have any people of color, you know, hosting news programs. We need to fix that. And they were like, sure. And, you know, 6 months later, we had a show on the air. So having that opportunity, even with the sort of threat of the bottom line, having that freedom is so refreshing, and I'm really, really grateful for it. And I don't want to tell people who are in public radio to all leave. It needs good people and fresh voices, and yeah.
What's your advice to people who want to get into podcasts but are told that they don't have the podcast voice? Like, they don't
Find
have
somebody else.
that romantic voice for radio, and it's like, their voice may be, like, they're told that their voice may be brassy or raspy or whatnot. Like, so what's your advice to those who are told you can't speak? Because not like you can't speak, but like your voice isn't meant for a podcast, just like your voice isn't meant for radio.
This is triggering. This is very triggering because, you know, there are a lot of podcasts out there, and there are a lot of people who are very irritating voices. I'm not going to name names, but I think, but I think that whole this voice from nowhere kind of aesthetic was born at a time when people were watching, three different news networks, where there was a Walter Cronkite or Roger Mudd or some one old white guy who everybody trusted. And the fact of the matter is, there are a lot of us who don't trust that voice. And there are, I don't know if millions is the right number yet, but there are thousands and thousands and thousands of podcasts aimed at people who want to hear from a 36-year-old smartass white guy from Brooklyn. And if you are creating another podcast for that audience, then you're in a list. You have to make yourself very, very distinct. And I think if I'm thinking of the Normal Gossip podcast, which I really enjoy. It's like there are people out there, there is an audience out there. You can phrase it as a business kind of equation, which is there's this whole untapped market of people who are not interested in listening to another 36-year-old white guy from Brooklyn, who want and need something to listen to, and I've got the stories to tell them. So, and if you are hearing no at an organization like that, you're at the wrong organization in this day and age. In 2022, somebody's telling you that you don't have a voice for podcasting. Why? Because it's so selective? No. You need to, that's a sign that you're talking to the wrong people.
So for if you want to pitch a podcast, what are some points that you need to have in there for a publication that we don't have a podcast? We do audio sometimes and do wrap-ups of our stories, but if you're a reporter, you have a good project that you want to turn into an audio story and into a podcast, into a series. What are some of the things that you can take to the editor and say, this is why we need a podcast for this story?
Well, it sounds like you're making this pitch to somebody who's a print person first. And that's a different challenge, because if you are pitching a podcast to somebody who knows audio, they can create sort of an audio picture in their ears. It's like, I don't want you to pitch here because then you're but who are we going to talk to? Where are we going to talk to them? What is the sound that we're going to hear in the background? Are we going to be walking through a street? Are we going to be close to a factory? Is there water nearby? Are planes overhead? These are the kinds of things, the texture of a story are very important to people who are audio natives. And so you can pitch a podcast to somebody who knows audio and point out that there's this one compelling voice or these two compelling voices, or there's this feeling that you can only get through sound. I worked with a reporter many, many years ago who went to a pool hall to get sound about I think it was a gang prevention program. And he went in there and I heard the sound and I was like, what happened? It sounded like a library. And he said, I told everybody to be quiet. And I'm like, no. But if you're pitching to a print person, you have to have more plot. You have to explain to them how this story is going to move, the voices that are going to carry it forward. You have to build suspense. What you want to watch out for is telling people, there's this one really smart person and this other really smart person, and these really smart people are going to say smart things into this microphone. Too many of those podcasts do get greenlit, but they don't sound good, and they're not going to survive. So if you're pitching a print editor, you gotta give them a plot. You gotta give them a hero, a central character. You've got to give them layers of the story that can only be moved forward or can most effectively be moved forward with voices.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Jarrell Arvin from Vox.com.
Hey.
And I had a question along similar lines as Brian's. Just what do you think makes a good podcast? And how would you suggest going from like idea to pitch? Like, what do you look for to know that the podcast is viable or not?
What makes a good podcast is discipline. I mean, I hate to sound very old school about it, but a lot of podcasts are based on the idea that this conversation between these two really incredible or interesting people or whatever is fascinating and compelling. And the art of listening from outside of your own experience. Not how does this sound to me as somebody who knows this story, as somebody who's really invested in this story, but as somebody who's just coming to it raw. Having that kind of perspective and being able to explain to somebody that awful question that I got asked by editors, and I in turn found myself asking other people is, why should I care about this? Why should I spend time with these people? And if your answer is, well, you just should because they're fascinating, you're off on the wrong foot. You need to be able to tell the story in a way that is going to grab somebody who didn't even know that they were interested, who didn't even know that this was, whatever this was happening out there, and make a case to them that they need to spend the next 40 minutes, the next hour for several weeks with you and with this story. So find your compelling voices, explain why this is not something that can be heard somewhere else. Talk about how you're going to fit your story into the space that you're asking for, because a lot of the time with audio projects, people say, oh, it needs to be, an hour, maybe 2 hours, maybe it'll take 3 months, maybe it'll take 6 months. It's like, it's still, even though podcasting doesn't have sort of page breaks, people's attention span does have limits, and you need to respect the limits of people's attention spans, and you need to do every bit of audio journalism in a way that people are dying to hear more, that they think at the end of your podcast they could listen to it for another 20 minutes, another hour, but never 1 minute beyond that.
So we want to ask you to go ahead, Amanda, with your question, and then we can wrap up.
Thanks for being here. My name's Amanda Goki.
Hi.
I'm a reporter with the New Hampshire Bulletin, and I wanted to ask you which podcasts you are delighted to listen to. Like, what do you enjoy listening to?
This is, I don't know if I want to say, I listen to the read. Because I'm and people who've worked in newsrooms with me know I'm a very serious person. And I'm the person who's like, is this fair? Have we asked the person on the other side? Is this Mississippi, or should we do this in Arkansas? I'm that person. And to listen to a conversation where people are just saying the first thing that comes to their mind, unfiltered, it's such a relief just to hear that. I love Normal Gossip. Code Switch is my baby. I don't listen to Up First at NPR because it stresses me out. It gives me PTSD. If you had to be there at like 4:30 in the morning, it does not sound the same to you. And of course, there are lots of really terrific podcasts at Slate to listen to. Dakota Ring, Slow Burn, our season on the LA riots just won an AMBI Award for Best History Podcast. I love podcasts, but I want to have a little bit of fun in my listening, so the read is my
Once
guilty
again,
pleasure.
yet another example of why we need women like Alicia in newsrooms. I think the tenor and the tone of her advice and the depth of her knowledge and her expertise is something that cannot be replaced. It cannot be sort of, we'll find somebody else to fit in it. We need this authentic voice and persona in our newsrooms. So I just want to say thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And we're going to have you back in not only in virtual format, hopefully we can continue the conversation, but when we return in person next March, we're going to throw a massive party, by the way.
Awesome.
But you will definitely be invited to that.
I
But thank you
appreciate
so
that.
much.
I appreciate
Thank
that.
you.
Thank you all for your patience. It was delightful.